The war had devoured nearly everything. Fields once golden with wheat now lay charred and empty. The sky, eternally gray, hung low over the village of Fairbrook, where the hum of daily life had been replaced by the distant crack of rifles and the occasional thunder of distant explosions. It was the kind of town that the generals didn't mark on maps. Too small, too quiet, but for the people who still clung to it, it was home. Among them was Clara Hayes, an awkward, quiet girl of 23, with calloused hands and a heart much larger than anyone bothered to notice. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't even strong enough to lift a rifle. And yet, for some reason, Clara refused to leave Fairbrook when the soldiers came through weeks ago, rounding up the able-bodied men and some of the braver women to march off to the front lines. She had stayed behind, not because she was a coward, but because no one asked her to come. "She'd just slow everyone down," one of the officers had said, loud enough for her to hear. "We need fighters, not frail girls who faint at the sight of blood." Clara had stood there and taken it. She always did. In the eyes of the others, she was the girl who never spoke up, who walked with a slight limp from a childhood injury, and who spent most of her time helping her aging father repair shoes or delivering bread from the bakery where she worked part-time. She wasn't known for courage. She wasn't even known for conversation. She was simply known as the girl who never belonged in war. But war doesn't care about perception. It was late October when the wind began to bite sharper and the forest surrounding the village grew quiet. Too quiet. That's when Clara first heard it. A groan, faint and muffled, coming from the direction of the woods behind her house. She froze, basket of laundry in hand, listening. There it was again. A grunt. Then a cough. She dropped everything and ran, without thinking, without waiting. The woods had been declared dangerous, possibly even mined, and yet her feet carried her across the brush with reckless urgency. The soldiers had moved on days ago, but enemy scouts were rumored to patrol this stretch of forest. She pushed through brambles and fallen leaves until she saw the source. Man. Barely alive. His uniform was torn, the green and brown of the Patriot army soaked in blood. His left leg was twisted at a sickening angle, and a jagged piece of metal protruded from his side. His rifle lay nearby, untouched, his face pale with pain. Clara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, fear gripped her. This was no ordinary soldier. He wore the insignia of a captain. His name Patch read R. Morgan. She had heard of him. Captain Ryan Morgan, one of the youngest and most fearless officers on the Southern Front. Rumors said he led a unit that held off 20 enemy men with just 5 soldiers and a ruined wall. His face was known, his reputation larger than life. And now he was dying. Alone. Just yards from her back garden. She knelt beside him, trembling, unsure of what to do. He blinked at her, barely conscious. "Help," he rasped, his voice cracked like dry leaves. I will," Clara whispered, even though she wasn't sure how. She ran back to her home, dragging a blanket and the thick rope they used to secure the carts. She didn't think about how heavy he might be. She didn't think about what might happen if the enemy returned. She just thought about saving him. When she returned, the captain was unconscious. She wrapped the blanket under his shoulders, gently but firmly, and tied the rope around his chest and waist to secure him. Then came the impossible part, dragging him. Clara wasn't strong, but desperation grants strength that muscle never could. Inch by inch she pulled him. Her hands blistered. Her back burned. She couldn't lift him, so she let the forest floor do its cruel work. Branches tore her sleeves, rocks bloodied her knees, and sweat poured down her face despite the cold. And still she dragged him, over roots, across mud, through narrow paths until they reached the back of her house. Her father was gone, taken by fever last winter. No one would interfere. No one would help. She rolled him into the shed behind the cottage and fetched water, cloth, and the limited herbs she had learned about from the village healer. She cleaned his wounds the best she could, breaking into sobs more than once at the sight of his battered body. She didn't know what she was doing, but she couldn't let him die. Not here. Not like this. 3 hours later, Captain Morgan opened his eyes again. "Who are you?" he whispered. Clara gave a timid smile through cracked lips. "Just someone they all forgot." He tried to sit up, winced, then lay back down. "You saved me." "Not yet," she said, adjusting the damp cloth on his head. "But I will." That night Clara kept watch, barely sleeping. She reheated broth over a small fire and kept it hidden behind layers of hay and smoke-dampened cloth so no light would escape. She listened for footsteps, for gunshots, for any sign that someone had seen her drag a wounded soldier out of the woods. But all she heard was the wind and the faint, shallow breathing of a man everyone else believed dead. And she realized something. This man mattered. And maybe, just maybe, so did she. By morning, the frost had crept over the ground like a thin sheet of silver. Clara's breath came in white clouds as she stoked the dying embers in the stove hidden inside the old shed. Her hands trembled, not from cold but from exhaustion. She hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time, jolting awake each time Captain Morgan let out a strained cough or shifted with a groan. She had wrapped him in every wool blanket she could find, stuffed hay around the corners of the shed to block drafts, and boiled every root, herb, and half-rotten potato she had left. She even sacrificed her winter coat to use as padding under his broken leg. Now she watched him sleep, eyes fluttering beneath his lids, a bandage wrapped tightly around his waist where the metal shard had been. Clara had removed it the night before, with shaking hands and no training, using a pair of rusted tongs and a bottle of moonshine her father had hidden beneath the floorboards. She wasn't sure how he had survived the pain, or how she had. Now, as the pale light of day filtered through the cracks in the walls, the captain stirred again. His eyes opened slowly, confused. Where am I?" Clara rushed to his side. "Shoo. You're safe. You're in Fairbrook, in my father's old shed." He blinked at her, trying to place the name. "Fairbrook. That's miles behind the front." "You crawled half dead through the woods behind my cottage," she said gently, soaking a cloth in warm water. "You were losing blood fast. I couldn't leave you there." Ryan Morgan tried to sit up. The pain shot through his body like fire, and he clenched his jaw. "Easy," Clara warned. "Your leg's broken, and your side is torn open. I did what I could, but I'm not a nurse." The captain looked at her for the first time, not just glanced but truly looked. Her face was pale, with freckles barely visible under the layer of soot and fatigue. Her hair was tied back in a hurried knot. Her clothes were ragged, and one of her sleeves was stained with dried blood. Yet her eyes were clear, steady, and full of something he hadn't seen in weeks. Calm. "You saved my life," he said hoarsely. "I tried," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "But you're still not safe. If they find you here, if anyone finds you here, they'll kill you." "Who?" "The enemy." Clara nodded. "A scouting unit passed through a few days ago. They're still in the woods. And our men are gone. All of them. They took the road south last week." The captain's jaw tightened. "I was separated from my company. We were ambushed on the ridge, near Hollow Creek. I thought I could loop around, find cover. I must have blacked out." "You nearly bled to death," Clara said softly. "But you're here now. And I won't let them find you." He stared at her for a moment, as if trying to understand who she really was. Then he asked, "What's your name?" "Clara. Clara Hayes." "I owe you everything, Clara Hayes." She blushed faintly and stood up. "Rest. I'll check the woods again. If they've moved on, I'll go into town for more supplies." "No," he said firmly, though his voice was weak. "Too risky. If you get caught, they won't hesitate." Clara looked at him with quiet defiance. "Neither did I." The walk into Fairbrook was nerve-wracking. Clara kept to the shadows, ducking behind hedges and fallen fences, ears tuned for every snap of a twig. The town had changed since the soldiers left. Windows were boarded, doors barred. A silence hung over the streets like a shroud. She reached the old bakery where she used to work and found it abandoned. The front door was unlocked, the shelves stripped bare. But she found what she needed: 2 jars of dried beans, a sack of barley, and miraculously, a spool of clean linen. She slipped the items into her satchel and turned to leave, only to hear footsteps outside. Clara's breath caught. She pressed herself behind the door, praying the intruder would pass. The boots paused. Then a voice, sharp, foreign, barked an order. Another pair of boots joined the first. Enemy scouts. Her heart pounded in her chest as they spoke in hushed tones. One of them knocked over a crate near the entrance. Clara fought to control her breathing. She couldn't afford a sound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boots faded. Silence returned. She waited 5 more minutes before slipping out the back and running through the alleyways. She didn't stop until she reached the trees near her home. By the time she made it back to the shed, her knees buckled. She dropped the satchel and collapsed onto the cold floor. Captain Morgan opened his eyes at the noise. "You went anyway." Clara nodded, still breathless. "We needed food, and clean bandages." He tried to speak, but she cut him off. "I saw 2 of them. They were searching houses. They're looking for you." Ryan's face darkened. "They know I survived." "I won't let them find you," Clara said. "But we have to move. Sooner than later." His eyes met hers. "I can't walk. You know that." "I'll think of something," she whispered. And she would. That night Clara didn't sleep. Instead, she worked by candlelight, cutting fabric into makeshift wraps, grinding herbs into poultices, and studying the forest maps her father once collected. There was a path, old, overgrown, that led north toward the river. If she could get the captain onto a sled or cart, and keep off the main roads, they might have a chance to reach the Patriot outpost 10 miles away. Fool's hope. But hope nonetheless. As the candle burned low, Clara looked over at the man resting on the makeshift bed of straw and blankets. His face was pale but peaceful. She tightened her jaw. Everyone had called her useless in war, but they had no idea who she really was. Clara had always believed that bravery was loud. Heroic charges, flags waving, voices shouting through the fog of battle. But as she stood outside the shed that dawn, frost biting her cheeks, she realized that true courage could be very, very quiet. It was courage in the way her fingers trembled as she tightened the final knot on the sled she had cobbled together overnight. It was in the way she stuffed extra cloth around Captain Morgan's chest, trying to shield his wounds from the icy wind. And it was in the way she swallowed her fear and whispered, "We're going now," even though every part of her wanted to run back inside and pretend the world outside didn't exist. Ryan Morgan, weakened and half-conscious from pain and fever, said nothing. But his hand squeezed hers. That was all the permission she needed. The sled was crude. A wooden cart meant for firewood, fitted with rope handles and padded with whatever soft material she could gather. It wasn't built for miles of travel, let alone over rough, frozen ground. But Clara wasn't built for war either. And here she was. She began to pull. The first stretch through the woods was the worst. Not just because of the uneven terrain and fallen branches, but because that was where the enemy scouts had last been seen. Every sound made Clara freeze. Every snapped twig, every bird that burst from a tree. She had taken a long path that curved around the village, avoiding all open ground. But it meant longer hours in the forest, and every minute counted. Captain Morgan moaned faintly from the cart behind her. His fever had returned. "Stay with me," Clara murmured over her shoulder. "We're going to make it. I swear we are." She didn't know if he heard. His eyes were closed. His breath was ragged. The cart snagged on a root and nearly tipped. Clara threw herself back, steadying it just in time. Her muscles screamed. Her hands, already raw from the previous night, began to blister. But she kept pulling. By mid-morning, snow began to fall, light at first, then faster. It clung to her lashes and soaked her shawl. Visibility dropped. The path she had memorized became harder to follow. Clara stopped just long enough to check Morgan's bandages. Blood. Too much of it. She bit her lip and added another layer of cloth, praying it would slow the bleeding. The cold might help, she told herself. It would numb the pain, slow the fever, but it could also kill him. She pressed a hand to his forehead. Burning. His body trembled beneath the blankets. "We don't have time to stop," she whispered. "Just hold on." Hours passed. Her arms ached. Her legs barely moved with her own command anymore. But the outpost was near, she could feel it. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, past the frozen creek. If she could just get over that hill. She stumbled, knees buckling. The rope slipped from her fingers, and she fell into the snow face first, gasping. For a long moment she didn't move. She lay there, snow pressing against her cheek, and thought about giving up. About how warm the snow felt. How quiet everything was. Maybe this was how people died in the cold. Just slipping into silence, slowly, painlessly. Then she heard a whisper. "Clara." He turned. Ryan Morgan's eyes were open, barely. His lips cracked, but he was trying to speak. Trying to reach her. "I'm here," she breathed, crawling back to the sled. "I'm right here." He tried to lift his head. "Don't stop. Please." The words gutted her. She had saved him once. She wouldn't fail now. Clara forced herself to her feet. She gripped the ropes again and pulled. And pulled. And pulled. By late afternoon she reached the ridge. From the top, through a break in the trees, she could just barely see the river. And across it, a trail of smoke rising into the sky. Chimney. The outpost. She laughed, dry and shaky, then quickly covered her mouth. Sound traveled fast in the woods. "We're almost there," she said, more to herself than to the man behind her. But between them and the river was open terrain. And she knew that was the most dangerous part of all. No trees. No cover. Just snow and exposed land for nearly 400 yards. She couldn't stop now. Clara took a deep breath, fixed the ropes over her shoulders, and began the descent. The snow helped. The sled slid easier downhill, but it also made it harder to stop. Halfway down the slope, she lost control and fell, tumbling as the cart spun behind her. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to check on the captain. He was groaning but still breathing. The jolt had opened one of the wounds again. She wrapped it tighter, whispering, "Just a little farther." Then she heard it shout from the woods behind her. Two figures, soldiers, emerged through the trees. Their uniforms weren't green. They weren't patriots. They saw her. One raised a rifle. Clara screamed and threw herself over Ryan. Shot rang out. Snow exploded inches from her foot. Then another voice, closer, stronger. "Drop your weapons," came from ahead. Clara looked up and saw them. Patriot soldiers, rushing across the field toward her. A dozen of them. One with a rifle raised. The enemy soldiers turned and fled, disappearing into the trees. Strong hands reached her a moment later. "Are you hurt?" one soldier asked. "It's Captain Morgan," Clara gasped. He's dying. Please help him." The men surrounded the sled. One knelt beside Morgan and checked his pulse. "He's alive. Barely. Get the stretcher," another barked. As they lifted him, Clara sank into the snow, too exhausted to move. Her vision swam. Her chest rose and fell with ragged gasps. But as someone draped a warm coat over her shoulders and whispered, "You're safe now," she allowed herself, finally, to let go. Hours later, inside the warm infirmary of the outpost, Clara sat wrapped in wool blankets, sipping broth from a tin cup. A medic had bandaged her hands and given her something for the pain. Captain Morgan was in the room next door, unconscious but stable. She stared at the floor, barely able to process it all. "You dragged him across enemy territory," someone whispered nearby. "Alone. She's the girl from Fairbrook," another voice said. "The one they said was useless." "Doesn't sound useless to me." Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because now, for the first time, they saw her. 3 days passed at the outpost before Clara stepped outside again. Each day had passed in a haze of whispered conversations, footsteps in hallways, and the faint moans of wounded soldiers echoing through the infirmary walls. The nurses had offered Clara a small cot in the corner, and though she had accepted it, she barely slept. Her body healed slowly, her hands, her knees, her shoulder, but her mind remained alert, hovering always near the door that led to the room where Captain Morgan lay unconscious. She checked on him every morning, every afternoon, and every time she heard a medic walk past. His condition was critical but improving, they said. The fever had broken, the wounds had been properly dressed, and the shrapnel site had been drained. The leg would take time, but he would survive. Every time Clara heard those words, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. The outpost commander, a tall, steel-faced man named Colonel Harwood, had summoned her on the second day. She expected questions, accusations even, for venturing through enemy territory. But instead, the colonel stood in silence for a long moment before offering her a chair and asking one quiet question. "Why'd you do it?" Clara stared at him, unsure how to answer. She wanted to say it was because she'd seen too many men die alone. That Captain Morgan was just another human being, broken and bleeding, and leaving him behind felt like letting the world lose something good. She wanted to say that for the first time in her life, she didn't wait for permission to be brave. But instead, all she managed was, "I couldn't leave him there." The colonel had nodded once, then dismissed her with the strangest look in his eyes, something between respect and disbelief. On the fourth morning, Clara was standing at the edge of the snowy field behind the outpost, watching a supply truck roll in from the north, when a soft voice behind her said, "You walk quieter than a soldier." She spun around. Captain Ryan Morgan stood there, leaning heavily on a crutch, wrapped in a long coat and a blanket over his shoulders. His face was still pale, but color had returned to his lips, and his eyes, though tired, had life in them again. Clara rushed forward. "You shouldn't be out of bed." "I couldn't stay in that room another minute," he said, chuckling hoarsely. "Besides, I heard the girl who saved my life was out here, and I wanted to thank her properly." She looked down, face flushed. "I didn't do anything any real soldier wouldn't have done." "You're wrong," he said, gently lifting her chin so their eyes met. "No soldier could have done what you did. Not like that. Not alone. Not without training, supplies, or backup. You crossed enemy lines carrying a man twice your size. That's not just brave, Clara. That's heroic." She swallowed hard. "I just didn't want to lose you." His expression softened. "You didn't." Later that evening, the mess hall was cleared for a rare event, a formal recognition ceremony. Clara didn't want to attend. She had tried to stay invisible for most of her life, fading into the background, avoiding attention. But a nurse handed her a dress someone had sewn together from spare cloth, and insisted she wear it. When she entered the room, the soldiers stood. Not one person whispered or mocked her limp. Colonel Harwood stood at the front of the room with several high-ranking officers behind him. He called her name, and Clara stepped forward nervously, her hands clenched at her sides. "This young woman," Harwood said, his voice ringing out with force, "was left behind because she was seen as weak, as someone who didn't belong in war. But 3 days ago, she crossed 8 miles of hostile terrain with a wounded officer strapped to a cart. She navigated minefields, avoided enemy patrols, and kept a captain alive when even trained medics would have called it hopeless." He turned to Clara. "On behalf of the Patriot Army and the Southern Front, I present you with the Silver Valor Cross, for extraordinary bravery in the face of enemy threat." Gasps filled the room. The Silver Valor Cross was the third highest honor in the military. Clara froze. She felt everyone watching her, waiting. And then, clapping. Soft at first, then louder. Not forced. Not polite. Earnest. She glanced to her right and saw Captain Morgan standing with the help of 2 soldiers, applauding with a proud smile. Her vision blurred with tears. For once, they weren't from exhaustion. Later that night, Clara returned to the quiet of the infirmary. The medal felt heavy in her hands. She sat beside Morgan's cot again, where he had returned to rest, and placed the medal gently on the table beside him. He turned his head toward her. "You're not going to keep it." "I didn't do it for medals." "Why did you do it then?" he asked softly. Clara hesitated, then answered truthfully. Because I was tired of being invisible. Tired of letting others decide what I was capable of. Ryan nodded slowly. Then you've done more than save my life. You've changed it. She smiled gently, brushing a bit of hair behind her ear. I think you've changed mine too. In the weeks that followed, Clara remained at the outpost, not as a civilian but as a logistics aide. She was offered a role organizing medical supplies, training messengers, and even assisting in planning routes through dangerous territories. Soldiers began to ask for her opinion. Some asked for her help, and a few even asked for her story. She told them only what they needed to know. Not because she was ashamed, but because courage doesn't need a spotlight. And as word of her rescue spread through nearby camps, other women began stepping forward. Women who had been told they were too weak, too slow, too soft. They came forward with eyes wide and questions burning. Can you show us how you did it? Clara did. Every time. Because the girl they had called useless in war was now someone others looked up to.